Hello and welcome everyone to the Intrepid Museum's live virtual programming and our Snackin' in Space program. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope you're hungry because today we are going to be talking all about space food. That's right, my friends. We are going to chat about the evolution of food up there in space from cubes and tubes all the way to shrimp cocktail and freshly baked cookies. My name is Alicia, and I'm an educator at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum in New York City. I'll be your host today, and I'd also like to give a warm welcome to Mike and Christopher, our fabulous American Sign Language interpreters who will be joining us on screen for our program today. So welcome. We are so thrilled to have you here with us. Now, just a quick reminder before we get started, the museum's live streams are free. And if you'd like to help us to support in delivering this fun content, please do click on the link that you can find in the comments or in the description. Also, feel free to use the chat today. Say hello, let us know where you're tuning in from, and also let us know if you've ever been to the Intrepid Museum before, or maybe if you plan on visiting us sometime soon. Now, at the museum, our mission is to honor our heroes, educate the public, and inspire our youth. And if you're new to the Intrepid, well, here it is. So, we are located in a historic World War II aircraft carrier, the USS Intrepid. It was constructed in 1943, and it's now docked right off the shoreline of Manhattan on the Hudson River. So, maybe you visited before, maybe you're looking forward to visiting us soon in the future, but either way, if you are in the neighborhood, it's kind of hard to miss. The Intrepid is so big that if you were to stand it up on its end, it would be taller than a New York City skyscraper. And it's also so long that you could just about play 3 games of football on it at the exact same time. Now, the Intrepid served in 3 wars: World War II, the Cold War, and the Vietnam War. And then it was retired back in 1974. Then, a few years later, in 1982, we became the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum. But sometimes we get visitors who say, okay, I know, why you're a sea museum. I get why you're an air museum, but why space? Why are you also a space museum? Well, let's recap. We are, of course, a sea museum because we are a naval ship, right? In fact, this giant artifact on display on the right here might bring that to life a little bit more for you. This right here is a propeller. In fact, it's one of 4 that were on the Intrepid that helped to push it through the water. But of course, there are a few different types of propellers. We've got another type of propeller here in front of this plane. This is part of the reason, of course, why we are an air museum. The Intrepid carried a number of airplanes. In fact, they could fit up to about 100 planes inside at a time. And it also had the ability to launch and land those planes just like you might do at an airport. So it was basically a floating airport. And this plane that we're looking at here is the Avenger from World War II. Now, later on, we also had jet planes like the Fury here, and those were around later during the Cold War, and they moved much, much faster. We also had helicopters, which were used to rescue people from the ocean as well. So, okay, clearly, yes, we are also an air museum because we've got airplanes and helicopters, but we're still not really sure about space, right? Well, take a look at this. Does anyone know what this thing is that we are looking at here? We are looking at this big black kind of light bulb shaped thing, right? It says United States on it. It's got a flag. Some people say, it kind of looks like an ice cream cone that's been tilted on its side, or maybe a megaphone that you might shout into. But this is actually a really special vehicle. This is called a space capsule. And it's the thing that takes astronauts way up into space. Now, capsules ride on the top of a rocket. The rocket, of course, is that thing that goes up into space. Lots of fire comes out the bottom to help it get there, right? But they actually separate from the capsule, and then the capsule stays up there floating around in outer space, too. Now, why space? Well, in the 1960s, during the Cold War era, NASA, our space program, was part of something called the space race. So we were in a race against the Soviet Union. Now, when you're in a race, there's usually a finish line, right? And the ultimate finish line was to see which country could get all the way to the moon first. But of course, there's a number of steps that you have to take first before you get there, right? You don't just roll out of bed and end up on the moon. So you have to figure out things like how to launch, right? How to breathe up there, how to work and sleep over long periods of time. And then you've got things like docking and landing, and of course, eating, right? But we'll get to that in a second. So these capsules were part of some of those early steps, what they called Project Mercury, which was really just to see if people could even reach outer space and survive up there for a while. Now, this is a replica of one of those early capsules called the Mercury Aurora 7. So let me know, maybe in the chat, how many people do you think could fit inside of this capsule? Take a look at that. What do you think? While you're doing that, I'll also tell you that they decided to name it Project Mercury because, first of all, in Roman mythology, Mercury was the messenger god. So, kind of like their mailman, you could say. And he was known for being really, really fast, which is pretty fitting because, of course, planet Mercury, which was named after him, is also both our first planet and also the fastest planet to orbit around the sun. So 1 year on Mercury takes only 88 days. Well, it actually takes us, of course, 365 days to go around the sun here on Earth. So they wanted to be the first and the fastest to get to the moon. So back to that Aurora 7 capsule, all right? So you could probably tell just by looking at it that, yeah, it's not very big, right? In fact, it only held one astronaut inside of it. So if anyone out there said one, Vashsin, I see you said one, yes, you would be correct. Now, in 1962, the astronaut who went up into space in the Aurora 7 was named Scott Carpenter. And here he is right next to the Mercury Atlas rocket that took him all the way up into space. Scott Carpenter was actually only up in outer space for about 5 hours. He did 3 orbits around the Earth before then safely splashing down into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, they figured, the water would be a nice, somewhat softer landing place than on land or on a mountain or someone's house or something. But, if something this big is going to be landing in the ocean, NASA still needs to go pick them up and, of course, pick the astronaut up too, right? You can't just leave him stranded in the middle of the ocean. So they sent out a helicopter to rescue him. But in this particular case, when they got to the place where he was supposed to be, they couldn't find him. And that's because while he was wrapping up his mission, Scott Carpenter had gotten a little distracted by one of his experiments, and he fired his re-entry thrusters 2 seconds too late. And as a result, he ended up splashing down over 200 miles off course. Well, fortunately, eventually they were able to track him down. He was just fine. So they picked him up and they flew him to the closest airport that happened to be floating in the water, which just happened to be, as you can guess, the Intrepid. And so here he is actually on board the ship. These are some photos from our collection. And there he is, surrounded by officers and onlookers on board the Intrepid after being picked up from his capsule in 1962. So it was a very, very momentous occasion. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the reason why we are a space museum. The Intrepid played a very important role in retrieving astronauts and their capsules after they returned from outer space. So, everyone, before we move on, I want to pause here and see if we have any questions about the space race. Feel free to ask in the chat if you do. And while you're doing that, before I actually switch that out, I want to point out something really neat in these photos here. On the right, you can see Scott Carpenter walking around one of our decks. And if you look closely at his feet there, you can see he's actually wearing a pretty sweet pair of cons, those sneakers there. So astronauts wear sneakers just like us too. How about that? All right, so let's pause here and we will see what questions we've got. All right. So first question, how long were the Mercury missions? Well, they were pretty short. Actually, again, we had to test out the water, so to speak, and see if we could even figure out how to sustain life up there before venturing out to the moon for, 2 weeks at a time. And this basically, means everything, basic bodily functions. No one knew even what microgravity would do to your body in space. And there's actually kind of a funny story that I can tell you about that. Our first American astronaut in space, his name was Alan Shepard. And he was the first to do something else as well. So his mission was really just to go up into space, then come right back down again. Total trip would have been 15 minutes. The problem is, once he got into the capsule, he realized that he had to go to the bathroom. But again, he figured, all right, mission's only 15 minutes. He could probably hold it. But this was the first time that we had sent an American into space. So they had a lot of delays. They wanted to make sure everything was just right. And they had these hour-long delays that eventually it was just too much. He couldn't hold it anymore. So he asked NASA for permission, and then he peed his pants. So they realized, yeah, they really had to think about how these astronauts were going to go to the bathroom over a period of weeks, and they invented these space diapers, basically. But they called them maximum absorbency garments. So a little bit more of a technical term for those. Great question. Any others? How do astronauts get food and supplies while in space? So they have to take it with them. These early missions were very short, so they could plan ahead. But today, on the International Space Station, they've got a ton of food stocked up that they store because, well, they stay up in space for long periods of time, right? So they get these resupply capsules that are sent to them, these care packages, you could say, and then they stock up over time. But yeah, they have to take a lot of that stuff with them. Great questions. All right, my friends. So I mentioned that our earliest space missions had a lot of experiments. And again, these were just baby steps. We needed to test everything out to make sure that this was even a good idea to be going into to space and then also onto the moon in the first place. And one of those things that they experimented with was, of course, space food. Now, throughout history, explorers have always had to deal with the availability of food or lack thereof while they were on these long expeditions. So maybe they were on a boat or on a camel in the desert, hiking through the wilderness, maybe, or even in a capsule in space. But this idea of getting nutrition so that you didn't develop something like scurvy, let's say, if you were a sailor on a ship, and then also, having enough for long periods of time, because those journeys can certainly last a while. And then also thinking about the fact that it can't weigh too much to burden you down. These have always been issues we've had to think about. Now, very early on, we discovered that food could be edible for longer periods of time if it was dried out. So often people would cut up meat or fish or fruits into long, thin strips and then dry them out in the sun. And of course, we still eat things like dried fruits or beef jerky, stuff like that. And a little later on, we also developed the idea of curing or rubbing things with salt to preserve it. Also, of course, freezing things make it last longer as well. And of course, canning, which many people are actually doing at home now. But not all of these storage solutions work really well for space flight. Up there, you have limitations to weight and volume. And if you add a lot of food weight, you also have to think about that in terms of how much extra rocket power you're going to need just to get off the surface. So they have to think about things like packaging too. What's that like in microgravity where things are floating around, right? And until more relatively recently, the lack of refrigeration up there as well. And that is where the genius of people at NASA came in. So early on in the space program, even before we sent anyone into space for the first time during the Mercury missions, there was actually some concern about the ability to swallow in microgravity and even being able to digest and absorb the food once you've actually eaten it. They didn't know what would happen to it in your body. And if everything's floating around, maybe your body can't move everything through your system like it's supposed to. They were also really concerned with how to prepare it. So things like how temperatures might affect it, or air pressure, or the lack thereof up there, and even things like the subtle vibrations that you would feel inside the capsules. They just had no idea what to expect. And so, of course, they also had to then consider the additional weight of all of the food on board those teeny tiny little capsules. So, in the earliest days of the space program, during Project Mercury, our flights really only ranged from a few minutes to about a day. So, they didn't really need too much food with them anyway. And often they started off by eating here on the ground first before then going up into space. So this photo is of John Glenn having breakfast on the morning of his first historic Mercury flight, where he became the first American to orbit the Earth or go around it. And this has really become a tradition now for the astronauts to have one last big meal on Earth before their mission. Because once these early astronauts then would go up, they would do a lot of food testing on those flights, but simple activities to start off with, things like chewing or drinking and swallowing both solid and liquid foods while they were in microgravity. So the earliest food systems used during the Mercury flights were similar to military survival rations, or even what hikers might take on a long trip. So they had to provide a lot of nutrition in a very small container. John Glenn was America's first man to eat in space. And in this picture here, you can see a tube, kind of looks like a toothpaste tube, right, with a straw coming out of it, floating next to him on the left. And on that historic mission, he did have, in fact, applesauce in a tube that you can see on the left. There is that same container, and pureed beef and vegetables from the tube on the right. He said he did find it pretty easy to eat in microgravity, but he also complained that the menu was a bit too limited for his tastes. Now, everyone, as we go through this history of space food, I do want you to pay very close attention, in particular, to the beef and vegetables, okay? This has historically been a pretty popular meal over the years, so you're actually going to be able to track how it progresses as we move through time. So make a mental note of that beef and vegetables. So we start off in a toothpaste tube. So, yeah, these first Mercury astronauts found themselves eating this thick, pureed paste that they would either suck through a straw or squeeze into their mouths from a toothpaste like aluminum tube, like you could see here. On the left, we've got bananas and then clam chowder on the right, as well as some dehydrated and compressed bite-sized cubes of food up in the top there. Real appetizing, right? And here is some more, actually, to give you an idea of this dehydrate stuff. So on the right side, here on the top, we've got some bread substitute bites that to me kind of look like croutons, maybe. Also some cookies and chocolate wafers in cubes, as well as some apricot bites. And then the rest of the photo here is a number of dehydrated powders that could be reconstituted, reformed with water. Just like a pudding mix, actually. So on the top row, we've got chicken, cocoa, and grape nuts in dehydrated milk. And then on the bottom there is banana pudding, beef and gravy, and some juices. So, we've had juices where you add water. That's not too unusual, but the rest of the food. Now, here is another photo of some dehydrated Mercury foods. We've got some different things here, some strawberries on the top left, pears on the top right, mushroom soup on the bottom, and wait for it, there it is, beef and vegetables. So now we have graduated from pureed goo in a tube to a freeze-dried log. Delicious. Now, this photo actually shows the mechanism for connecting a water dispenser to the food containers that I just showed you. So each portion of food was individually packaged in these flexible, transparent pouches, and a water injection port was there. And then after the water was actually inserted into the package from a pouch that they had brought on board, they would mash it all up and then squeeze it out to eat. Just kind of like if you've ever had Go-Gurt, right? The yogurt in a tube. Suck it up like that. But overall, the food wasn't very appetizing. And they also kept running into problems when they tried to rehydrate the powders and add water. They didn't always work right. So fortunately, the Mercury missions weren't that long anyway. So food was ultimately less essential for survival. Now, I mentioned that the Intrepid picked up the Aurora 7 capsule, but that actually was not the only one we picked up. We also picked up this one. So the next series of missions were called the Gemini Missions, and these were named Gemini after the constellation Gemini, the twins, if you're familiar, because it was the first time that NASA sent two astronauts up into space together inside of the same capsule. So it was a little bit bigger than the Mercury capsule that we just looked at. And on board the Gemini 3 mission, we had these guys, Gus Grissom and John Young. So these two astronauts went into outer space. They also orbited the Earth 3 times, and then they also splashed down into the Atlantic Ocean. So here is a picture of the Intrepid actually retrieving the Gemini capsule from the ocean in 1965. But some of the later Gemini missions were much longer, up to 2 weeks at a time, in fact. And so this was when some major advancements in space food were born. NASA teamed up with the Whirlpool Corporation. So that is that company that makes those refrigerators and washing machines and stuff, as well as with the Army, because they'd been making survival rations for years already, to develop some new food and new packaging. And of course, the first thing to go were those aluminum squeeze tubes because, first of all, they were just gross, but also the metal tubes themselves weighed more than the food inside them. So weight was a problem. They had to go. So NASA knew that if they weren't going to, have these properly packaged foods floating around in microgravity, this was going to be a problem. It could damage equipment or even worse, be inhaled. So they also worked with the Pillsbury Company to develop an edible gelatin layer that would go over the food to reduce the crumbling of these dehydrated cubes. So these foods were vacuum sealed into individual plastic pouches for easy storage. As you can see here in this picture, we've got date fruitcake, brownies, apricot cereal, and strawberry cubes. But again, covering already dehydrated cubes with gelatin doesn't sound very appetizing, right? And some of the astronauts didn't think so either. So there's actually a pretty infamous story that we do like to tell about the Gemini 3 mission in 1965, which was one of the missions that the Intrepid picked up. So again, on board Gemini 3 were 2 astronauts, Gus Grissom and John Young. And one of the experiments that they were tasked with on their 5-hour mission was to sample 2 meal packages. So this is actually one of those meals. It had in it dehydrated beef pot roast, orange juice, toasted bread cubes, bacon and egg bites, and a wet wipe. They weren't supposed to eat the wet wipe, obviously. Well, 2 days before the launch, fellow astronaut and practical joker Wally Schirra stopped by a place called Wolfie's Restaurant and Sandwich Shop in Cocoa Beach, Florida, right next to Cape Kennedy. He picked up a corned beef sandwich, and right before the launch, he gave it to John Young as a joke. Well, John kept the sandwich, and in fact, he smuggled it up with him into space by hiding it in his spacesuit. And once they got into orbit, he pulled out that corned beef sandwich and he took a bite, even offered some of it to his friend Gus. And they ate the first corned beef sandwich in space. But here is the problem, right? You eat a sandwich in space, it's a little different than on Earth. On Earth, you've got crumbs, right? We've got gravity here, so it, brings all the crumbs down. But in space, they don't go down. They're going to float up and everywhere. And that's exactly what happened. Now, that is actually, again, incredibly dangerous because, like I said, those crumbs could have gotten lodged into their equipment, or worse, someone could have inhaled them. So, of course, they quickly realized it was a really bad idea and they put it away. But NASA had heard every word of their conversation, and they got in a lot of trouble when they finally got back home. Now, they didn't lose their jobs, but they did have to publicly apologize to Congress, who was furious with them because they were wasting time and money, and they weren't eating all of this fancy experimental food that they had sent up in the first place. But it actually really helped NASA to think more about this issue of crumbs and other types of food that they should or should not take up on those early flights. So now, if an astronaut wants to eat a sandwich in space, they don't use bread, they use tortillas instead, because those are flat packed and don't make crumbs the same way. Now, you're probably wondering, what are we looking at here? What is this sandwich? Well, this is actually a tribute to that infamous corned beef sandwich. It is an actual sandwich memorialized in resin at the Gus Grissom Memorial Museum in Indiana. So Congress may not have thought it was very funny, but they and we certainly did. So shout out to our friends at the Gus Grissom Memorial Museum. Now, almost 2 decades later, John Young, who you can see floating upside down here, became the first commander of the space shuttle. And at that point, the food had progressed quite a bit. So you know what he ate for lunch in space? As you can guess, corned beef, all properly irradiated and sealed this time, though. But back to Gemini, water was actually produced on board as a byproduct of fuel cell operation. And it could be injected with this little hose that you can see there. So that just add water, dehydrated foods, it gave them a little bit more options. And it really cut down on the weight of having them bring all that extra water up into space with them. So in this picture, you can kind of get a sense of what it might have looked like at mealtime. You had strawberry cubes that you just sort of popped into your mouth up there on the left. Then the beef is now there, kind of reconstituted in that bag, reformed with water. And some of the other food flown on later Gemini missions were cinnamon toasted bread cubes, chocolate cubes, cream of chicken soup, turkey and gravy, and even, believe it or not, shrimp cocktail. As time went on, they made a number of additional changes, mainly because they realized that food wasn't as nutritionally balanced as they had wanted originally. And also the food preparation, it took a lot of time and effort. And sometimes the meals themselves just didn't taste great because the water they were using from the fuel cells also had dissolved gases in it. So maybe not the cleanest thing either to be eating as well. And some things just didn't, again, reform properly too when you add water. So I want to pause here one more time, see if we've got any more questions. And we'll let our ASL tippers switch out as well. All right. So first question here. How do astronauts eat when they are in their spacesuits on spacewalks? Yeah. So the astronaut suits actually have pouches for water with straws that they can drink from, and even a little snack bar. So kind of like a power bar, really, that they can have in the helmets of their suit that they just sort of, lean in to eat. Because of course they can't use their hands. They've got these pressurized spacesuits on, so they can't, open their visor or anything. So it all has to be reachable just by leaning their heads to suck on a straw or something like that. So that's a great question too. Any others? Do astronauts get to pick their own food when they go into space? So yeah, starting around the Gemini missions, they could pick their food. They had a standard menu, but they were able to swap things off and pick off of a list, basically, of foods a la carte. And in fact, one of the most popular dishes was shrimp cocktail because actually of the cocktail sauce. So when you go into space in microgravity, the fluids in your body, they start to shift around a bit. Against that microgravity, it kind of does that to you. And a lot of it actually goes into your head and in your nasal passages. So if you've ever had that feeling of being congested when you have a cold, it's kind of sniffly, right? They often report feeling that way, even though they're not sick. And when that happens, you can't really taste flavors that well, right? So your taste buds actually get affected by that fluid shift. That's what they call it, fluid shift. So astronauts apparently really love spicy foods because they're able to better taste them. Who can't taste that spice on your tongue, right? Of course, now with the cocktail sauce, there's all that horseradish in it that gives it that really spicy flavor. So that really tangy spice to it. They love their shrimp cocktail. It's actually still, I believe, quite a popular meal up there. All right. So moving on here, by the time of the Apollo program, the quality and the variety of food increased even more. And so, in fact, the first manned Apollo mission, which was Apollo 7, it had 96 food items available. Apollo astronauts were also the first to have hot water and cleaner this time too, which made the rehydrating the foods actually easier. And it also really improved the taste since it wasn't just room temperature water all the time, right? So some of the earlier packages were actually those plastic tube pouches that they would eat out of. But eventually, a number of foods were changed to this new spoon bowl package. So on the left here, we've got chicken and rice. So that flew on Apollo 11, where they landed on the moon. And then you can also see it's a plastic container here. It is hydrated through a valve that's on one side and then opened with a zip top. And then its contents are just eaten out the top with a spoon. It's kind of like a bowl, hence the name spoon bowl bag. And on the right, same idea. It's labeled as spiced fruit cereal. And it's also got dehydrated milk powder mixed into it too. So if I had to guess, I would think that's basically Apple Jacks and milk for breakfast there. Pretty yummy breakfast. And then, of course, we can see our Apollo progression of none other than beef with vegetables. There it is. So again, still a dehydrated log at first, but now once they add hot water, there you go. They can just eat it with a spoon instead of slurping it out with a straw, which again, probably a little bit more appetizing. Also, in case you were wondering, the first NASA meal eaten on the moon consisted of bacon bars, peaches, sugar cookie cubes, coffee, and a pineapple grapefruit drink. Pretty appetizing, I guess, right? Now, some of the other foods that were consumed during the Apollo missions were things like coffee, cheese crackers, sausage patties, scrambled eggs, peanut cubes, tuna salad, spaghetti and meat sauce, beef pot roast, all these different things that we can see on there. Again, there's bacon bars, some chocolate pudding there, and even, believe it or not, hot dogs. Look at that, all sealed up and irradiated to protect them from growing bacteria. So we actually still use some of this technology to prevent food from spoiling. So with the later shuttle missions, and actually largely through today, the food does look a little bit more normal. Here we can see a few of the different types. We can still, of course, have these rehydratable foods. So they're freeze dried, and all the water, again, has been removed. So we have things like soups and scrambled eggs. But we also then have intermediate moisture foods. So these are things that have some water in them. So dried fruits like apricots. And then also we've got these natural form foods. So these are things that have a really long shelf life already. Stuff like nuts and candies and condiments, that sort of thing. Then they've also got thermostabilized food. So these are things, again, that have been exposed to heat to kill the bacteria, things like canned foods and pudding cups, even. Now, everyone, I know we have covered a ton of food so far, but I know you also really want to know about one particular space food, okay? I know you're wondering, what is the deal with astronaut ice cream, right? It's this wacko idea of food in space. It's become such a novelty. And honestly, this is the stuff that people think about first. It's so popular in gift shops. And it's just so chalky and weird to eat if you've ever tried it. I always loved this stuff when I was growing up. It's really kind of strange, but it's kind of good in a weird way. But I do have a very terrible secret to tell you all. Astronaut ice cream and ice cream sandwiches, actually, at least this stuff, never went into space. Now, the main reason is just that they didn't like it, right? I mean, honestly, if you've ever seen it, it's messy, it's crumbly. And so, of course, the crumbs, right? Very problematic, a disaster in microgravity. This stuff would get everywhere. I don't know if you've ever opened a package. I don't think I've ever had my astronaut ice cream in one brick. It's always broken into a billion pieces. Disaster. Now, freeze-dried ice cream cubes, though, were originally developed for early Apollo missions by Whirlpool, again, the refrigerator company, but it never made it on board. There was one press release about the Apollo 7 mission that listed vanilla ice cream as a dessert on board the ship. But Walt Cunningham, who was one of the few surviving astronauts from that mission later on, confirmed that numerous times he confirmed that ice cream was never actually on the menu for them up there. But I will say this, in 2006, a freezer was flown aboard the space shuttle to store research samples. So they decided, okay, it's an empty freezer. We're flying it up anyway. So they decided to actually send them up with the real thing finally. They sent up some individually portioned little ice cream cups for the astronauts to enjoy in space. So there was astronaut ice cream. It just certainly didn't look anything like this. So everyone, I would like to thank you all so much for tuning in today for our Snacking in Space program. I hope you learned something cool. And I do want to pause and see if we've got any other final questions as we round out the program today. Any last burning questions? All right. So first question, why did NASA break up the plan to go to the moon in 2 missions? So again, baby steps, really. They didn't know what to expect when they started off. So Mercury was all about just figuring out how to breathe, how to do basic bodily functions, and just survive in space. Could it even happen? Then later on, we had Gemini, which is kind of like, the toddler phase, we could say. This is where we were learning how to walk. This was when we had our first extravehicular activity, spacewalks outside of the capsule. We were eating a little bit harder foods. We were making friends by docking our capsules in space, you could say. And then eventually we get to Apollo, which is where we could say it's our restless teenager phase, taking the car out for a joyride all the way to the moon. So they broke it up because they just needed to experiment slowly, make sure they didn't take too big of a step too soon, just to make sure the astronauts and everyone was safe. All right, any other questions? Can they make their own food in space now? Yeah, actually, they can. They have successfully grown a number of vegetables in space. And this has been a long time thing, truly. They have been studying for a while the effects of microgravity and solar radiation on growing plants and vegetables and things, because NASA, of course, someday wants to send people all the way to Mars, right? And that's going to be important. This idea of hydroponic planting. That means when you take a plant and you put it in nutrient dense water without soil, since, Martian soil is so different than what we have here on Earth, and plants can actually grow in water and only water, even in outer space too. So far we've grown lettuce and tomatoes and potatoes. If you've ever seen The Martian, he's growing potatoes on Mars. And actually currently they're growing chili peppers up there on the International Space Station right now. So definitely, yes. If you're into salads and vegetables, you are good to go. But most of it right now is brought up. I will add, though, that earlier this year, for the first time, they actually baked cookies in space. They baked chocolate chip cookies. So the Doubletree Hotel sponsored this very fun experiment where they sent up their chocolate chip cookie dough, which is delicious, and a zero-G oven that was designed to work in space. But what's really interesting is that they had to experiment on the bake times for the cookies. They had sent them instructions and they did not work. Normally you bake cookies for 20 minutes, right? And then they're good, they're yummy. But they have found that the sweet spot while leaving them up in space was actually 2 hours. So either that oven was calibrated a little bit off, or possibly the microgravity does something to the way that things bake, or the lack of the air pressure is a little different, So they do need to kind of keep testing that out to get the bake times just right. But for the first time, they were able to bake chocolate chip cookies in space. And they also had to weight it down with these silicone sheets. It was very interesting. All right, that's a great question. Well, everyone, if you've got any other questions about our programs, you can reach out to us through our website, intrepidmuseum.org, or also, of course, through social media. I would like to thank you all so much for watching and sharing your questions and comments today. Do be sure to follow or subscribe to this channel and visit our website for our upcoming programs. And of course, thank you again to Mike and Chris, our interpreters, for our wonderful interpreting today for our program. Our next family program is Tuesday at 3 p.m., where we will be flying in style. We're going to take a close-up look at some of the artwork and the symbols that can be found on our airplanes and talk about how they help to identify them and their countries and their squadrons. So that's next week on Tuesday at 3 p.m. right here on this or any of our other streaming platforms. Also, I invite you to join us tonight in just about an hour or so for our virtual astronomy live event with Kerbal Space Academy. So this is a free online event that's going to explore the evolution of spacesuits this month. And you'll also get to hear from some NASA engineers and even ask them your questions. So be sure to also tune in beforehand at 5 p.m. for our pre-show, where we'll talk all about what would happen to your body in space if you didn't wear a spacesuit. Once again, that is tonight in just about an hour. The pre-show starts at 5 p.m. and the main event starts at 5:30 p.m. So that's Eastern Standard Time. So you can register in advance via our website, intrepidmuseum.org, and that is free. Now, once again, our museum is back open to the public 7 days a week from 10 to 5 p.m. So we'd love for you to stop by, visit us, check out some of the cool things that we've got on display. So, once again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. And hopefully, we will see you online for another upcoming program. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.